Good news, your tax dollars are not only funding a variety of global wars, they're also funding the censorship and smearing of anti-war voices. And it's all included in one package. Actually, it isn't. You're charged separately for the whole thing. Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on this voyage to truth and freedom. Click the link in the description, become a member of our community. You get an additional video every single week talking about topics that would be heavily censored on YouTube, probably heavily censored anywhere, as a matter of fact, because censorship is immersive and sprawling. And do you know that deep state agencies have found a way to censor and shut down anti-war voices, even in Ukraine? So there are Ukrainian media outlets making content to smear anti-war voices like this voice now that's talking right now, this voice, my voice, as well as Max Blumenthal and Jimmy Dore and a variety of other people that are saying, should we have a diplomatic, peaceful solution? The deep state are funding the smearing of those voices, almost as if there's a concerted effort to ensure that war is continually perpetuated and anyone opposing war is one way or another brought down, shut down and smeared. And thanks to some great journalism, we can see the paper trail right from your pocket and your hard work into silencing anti-war voices. Let's show you how this works. First of all, Max Blumenthal posted this tweet. The State and National Endowment for Democracy, a CIA cutout, are funding shady NGOs in Kiev to smear American critics of the disastrous Ukraine proxy war. US government-sponsored Vox Ukraine has a series of videos attacking me, Jimmy Dore, Wyatt Reed 13, at Rusty Rockets, and more. Of course, you know which one I'm going to focus on primarily. Here is a piece of content created by that deep state-funded outlet attacking me.
Russell Brand is a British actor, publicist, and broadcaster who began his career as a comedian. Brand leads an outrageous lifestyle and is constantly placed in all sorts of scandals. YouTube has already stripped his channel of ad revenue for violating its creator liability policy.
By the way, we got that translated. To be fair to the host, she was saying it in Ukrainian, so that even Ukrainian people stopped liking me. What's the value of that?
Now the channel has 6.5 million subscribers, is devoid of monetization. By the way, it became especially popular during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Brand began to spread conspiracy theories about the coronavirus.
Well, quite. Conspiracy theories like maybe lockdowns haven't been correctly researched, maybe the vaccines don't stop transmission, maybe Pfizer and Moderna take too much money, maybe there's a revolving door between Big Pharma and the regulatory bodies that are meant to prevent them from exploiting the population. There was a whole host of conspiracy theories that were peddled during that period. But let's focus now not on the corruption of the pharmaceutical industry. I feel that you've been convinced of that. Let's look at the military-industrial complex and how they work in conjunction with the deep state to take your tax dollars to shut down anti-war voices. This is by the excellent journalist Li Fang. You should follow him on Substack. Ukraine's American-backed fight against Russia is taking place not only in the blood-soaked trenches of the Donbass region, but also on what military planners call the cognitive battlefield to win hearts and minds. I don't like the phrase cognitive battlefield. That means your consciousness is their territory. A sprawling constellation of media outlets, organized with substantial funding and direction from the US government, has not just sought to counter Russian propaganda, but has supported strong censorship laws and shutdowns of dissident outlets, disseminated disinformation of its own, and sought to silence critics of the war, including many American citizens. Economist Jeffrey Sachs, commentator Tucker Carlson, journalist Glenn Greenwald, and University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer are among the critics of both the left and the right who have been cast as part of a network of Russian propaganda. But the figures targeted by the Ukrainian watchdog groups are hardly Kremlin agents. They simply have forcefully criticized dominant narratives around the war. Sachs is a highly respected international development expert who has angered Ukrainian officials over his repeated calls for a diplomatic solution to the current military conflict. Last November, he gave a speech at the United Nations calling for a negotiated peace. Mearsheimer has written extensively on international relations and is a skeptic of NATO expansion. He predicted that Western efforts to militarize Ukraine would lead to a Russian invasion. Greenwald is a Pulitzer Prize-winning independent journalist who has criticized not just war coverage but media dynamics that suppress voices that run counter to US narratives. What they mean when they demand censorship of pro-Russian propaganda is anything that questions the US-EU role in the Ukraine war or who dissents from their narratives, Greenwald has observed. There is no evidence of Kremlin influence over their viewpoints, but their comments alone are enough for a network of US-backed Ukrainian media groups to tarnish these experts as Russian propagandists. So, legitimate journalists like Glenn Greenwald and academics like Mearsheimer and Sachs are being tarnished as pro-Putin. I've met that Jeffrey Sachs attacks. I know Glenn Greenwald pretty well, and they're not people that particularly, it seems to me, to have much skin in the game when it comes to geopolitical conflicts. They're, in the case of Jeffrey Sachs, just an academic who said, well, actually, no, the history of Ukraine's quite complicated. There was a coup in 2014, and like Mearsheimer, I don't know him, but I like his content and his academic work, and he seems to be simply trying to relay facts in a rather dispassionate manner. And Glenn Greenwald is a brilliant journalist who I care about as a human being, but also, I don't imagine he's someone who would just, like, for a laugh, take a bunch of money from Putin or victimize Ukraine for no good reason. These are all very credible professionals who I strongly suspect don't have powerful pro-Putin or pro-Russian views, are simply interested in telling the truth. Note too that these agencies and their backers are censoring voices on both the left and right. So if you're on either the left or right, remember, those distinctions don't matter anymore, and we have to recognise that peripheral anti-establishment voices have to unify, put aside their differences, if we're ever going to address this increasingly centralised and authoritarian power. US taxpayer dollars are flowing to outlets such as the New Voice of Ukraine, Vox Ukraine, Detector Media, the Institute of Mass Information, the Public Broadcasting Company of Ukraine, and many others. Some of this money has come from the $44.1 billion in civilian needs foreign aid committed to Ukraine. While the funding is officially billed as an ambitious program to develop high-quality independent news programs, counter malign Russian influence, and modernize Ukraine's archaic media laws, the news sites in many cases have promoted aggressive messages that stray from traditional journalistic practices to promote the Ukrainian government's official positions and delegitimize its critics. We can't bring you this earth-shattering, paradigm-changing content without the support of our partners and without clear heads. That's why I'm happy to tell you that AirTech are the only published, peer-reviewed, patented EMF protection solution. That means electromagnetic field, you know that. Trusted by experts, neuroscientists, doctors, biohackers, and pro-fighting athlete cage fighters. Its effectiveness has been proven in real time using EEG brain scan demonstrations. Remove the fear and unknown levels of daily exposure and have peace of mind with AirTech Life-Tune protection. Over 20 years invested in research and development, AirTech technology creates synergy between you and your devices by modulating and transforming chaotic frequencies to match our own biological energy. Unlock better wellness. Go to airstech.com and use the code Russell30 for 30% off your entire purchase. Have one of these in your area. And remember, if you're an awakened wonder, you can see in our 5G video exactly why this stuff is so important. So take advantage of this offer. Click the link in the description. Let's get back to the content, baby. Unlike similar media development programs that the International Agency for International Development, USAID, had led throughout the Middle East, Ukrainian outlets tend to produce a great deal of English content that trickles back into the domestic American audience and explicitly targets American foreign policy discourse. The New Voice of Ukraine syndicates with Yahoo News. Vox Ukraine is a fact-checking partner with Meta, which assists in removing content deemed Russian disinformation from Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Detector Media has similarly led a consortium of non-profit groups pressuring social media platforms to aggressively remove content critical of Ukraine. That's very interesting. So, it's not just happening in Ukraine, although that video that we showed you a moment ago is in Ukrainian and therefore presumably for a Ukrainian audience. Elsewhere, New Voices of Ukraine is being syndicated with Yahoo News, which is significant. Vox Ukraine is a fact-checking partner with Meta, and they assist in removing content deemed Russian disinformation. Now, of course, if you are Ukrainian and you're living in Ukraine, your opinion on Russia might be somewhat biased. But what are the interests of these CIA carve-outs in promoting particular views and participating in the censorship, not only, it seems, of Ukrainian voices and improving Ukrainian independent media and archaic Ukrainian laws, but shutting down dissent from within your country and from within my country? Don't we have the right to express anti-war, pro-peace and diplomacy views? Again, I can't speak for those other brilliant academics and professionals, but for myself, I'm not anti-Ukraine and pro-Russian. I'm pro not spending tax dollars in perpetuating unwinnable wars, and I'm largely pro-peace and think that as a species we should have evolved beyond the point where we're teetering on the brink of a nuclear war because people won't sit down nicely and come to some mutually amenable agreement. Congress is now weighing a new supplemental funding measure with approximately $60 billion earmarked for the war in Ukraine. A small portion of the emergency spending package is devoted to continued USAID programs in the the country. Information control is a central dynamic playing out in the Ukraine-Russia war. US media have provided wide coverage of President Vladimir Putin's efforts to clamp down on critical news outlets, enacting new criminal penalties for those publishing false information about the conflict. But far less attention has been paid to the Ukraine government's crackdown on independent and opposition media, a push aided by the US-backed network of anti-disinformation groups. Even as Washington's efforts to censor information at home is drawing greater scrutiny, its support of Ukraine's efforts reflects the increasingly global reach of the American government's propaganda arms. I wouldn't imagine that things like this were happening, would you? That the CIA had carve-outs that were funding groups in Ukraine that were censoring American voices. It's quite convoluted for something that ultimately you're funding. There's an information war going on between Russia and Ukraine, and the United States is not a disinterested party. We're an active participant, said George Beebe, a director with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The US government has been trying to shape perceptions, and it's very difficult to separate what's intended for foreign audiences from what seeps into the Anglosphere media, if you want to call it that, including here in the United States. American influence in Ukraine's media environment stretches back to the end of the Cold War, though it has intensified in recent years. Since the outbreak of the war, USAID, or USAID, support has extended to 175 national Ukrainian media entities. Over the last decade, efforts to crack down on speech have been increasingly justified as an effort to protect social media from disinformation. The US helped set up new think tanks and media watchdogs and brought over communications specialists to guide Ukraine's approach. Nina Jankovic, the polarizing official whom President Biden appointed to lead the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board to police social media content, previously advised the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry on its anti-disinformation work. It increasingly seemed, doesn't it, that the categories of disinformation and misinformation were deliberately invented so that you could now have departments to tend to disinformation and misinformation, and so that there could be budgets for those departments, and so that those budgets could seep into media organisations that had a remit that includes censorship, shutting down dissenting voices, smearing opposing voices, and cleaning up social media platforms. It amounts to censorship and smearing, propaganda and control, but it's so bureaucratically entangled and framed in the language of, hey, we're here to help, in the same way as the war is supposed to be humanitarian rather than some sort of colonial or for-profit endeavour. The censorship project is always seen as somehow necessary to protect us and our apparent inability to determine good from bad unless someone pre-chews our information and parcels it up nicely for us, as is clearly happening here. When Nina Jankovic and that government disinformation board was set up, I feel like there was a lot of pushback, and a lot of people felt like, this isn't legit, this disinformation board. They set them up in our country as well. The BBC run them, and there's all sorts of various attempts to pretend that there are groups that are there to protect us and ensure that we only get information that's good for us. I remember that many people thought, this is not legitimate, this is not reliable. It was a bit of a PR disaster, and they had to change its name and repackage it and reposition it. Isn't it extraordinary to see Nina Jankovic literally outsourced to other nations to carry on the project as if it was a tremendous success? Can you get any closer to neo-colonialism and imperialism than that? We created this here in America, it's worked so well, it didn't work at all. We're going to outsource it so you can have your own disinformation and malinformation boards. That's how it looks now. Remember when we often talk about how dictatorships now won't be militaristic, but bureaucratic, technological, anodyne and astringent? Well, it's the same here with the methodology. It doesn't look like tanks rolling into town. It's like Nina Jankovic coming into town saying, we're going to help you with your misinformation and malinformation. But nevertheless, these are methods and means of control. And again, you're funding them. It's an American project. In response to questions about the US-backed anti-disinformation groups in Ukraine targeting Americans, the US State Department provided a statement saying it defines disinformation as false or misleading information that is deliberately created or spread with the intent to deceive or mislead, while noting that the US provides funding to credible, independent media organizations to strengthen democracies in the countries we work in around the world. The statement declared, we do not control the editorial content of these organizations. We're just kind of helping these guys, giving them a little leg up. Here, there's Nina Jankovic. Get that down your neck. However, disclosures indicate that the US government and its contractors tasked with reforming Ukraine's institutions have directly set the agenda for Ukrainian outlets. It's, again, eerily similar to the rhetoric around the provision of weaponry or ongoing events in the Middle East. It's none of our business. Israel can just do, I don't know what they're doing. What happened exactly? And the same in Ukraine. We're not at war with Russia. Everything's sort of being done. They're just at a keyboard, just innocently. Oh, it's that explosion. Oh, it's a genocide over there. Here, you might want to say this about Glenn Greenwald. It's none of their business. It's really odd and opaque and mysterious and frightening. Immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, the USAID dispensed emergency grants to its media partners, partly through Zinc Network, a contractor based in London that's been accused of setting up covert public relations campaigns on behalf of the British government. I wonder what kind of covert public relations campaigns. The grant description notes that money went to the Zinc Network and Detector Media to assist the Ukrainian government with strategic communications and to undermine Kremlin information operations. Last September, journalist Jack Paulson reported on a leaked report from the Zinc Network's Open Information Partnership, which helps coordinate the activities of several anti-Russian disinformation non-profits around Europe backed by NATO members, including Detector Media. The lengthy report defines disinformation as not only false or misleading content, but also verifiable information which is unbalanced or skewed, amplifies or exaggerates certain elements for effect, or uses emotive or inflammatory language to achieve effects which fit within existing Kremlin narratives, aims, or activities. I sense they get a bit closer to me when I see terms like emotive and inflammatory language. But what I will tell you is that I'm not trying to fit within existing Kremlin narratives, because I don't actually know what existing Kremlin narratives are, although I'll take a wild guess that they prefer that Russia's agenda were pursued globally and in regional conflicts. But that sometimes converges with my general belief that we should be pursuing peace and not funding unwinnable wars that could lead to nuclear Armageddon. I don't know if that's part of the Kremlin's deal or not. We'll look into it. In other words, factual information with emotional language that simply overlaps with anything remotely connected to Russian viewpoints is considered disinformation, according to this US-backed consulting firm helping to guide the efforts of Ukrainian think tanks and media. I think that's sort of quite telling, actually. It's like they want to keep us in a sort of a flat, bureaucratic, anodyne environment. Because think how that could be applied to a variety of subjects if this was allowed to continue. You know, some of these organisations, like Logically AI, are working in your country in the lead up to the presidential election. So if you've got strong feelings and you use emotive language online on social media sites, that's disinformation. That was some emotional language. Hey, I don't like the way my country is being controlled by bureaucrats who just seem to want forever wars. That was a bit emotional. Well, I am emotional about wars. Sorry, you are? You can't censor people for being emotional and telling the truth. That's censoring a type of person and a type of trait. It's not about facts, it's about how you express those facts. So if you're just a good communicator, they're going to shut you down. They'll get you one way or other. But everything I said was true. Yeah, but there's some quite good jokes in there, so I'm afraid we're going to have to kill you. Where's this going? Many of the broad narratives the report identified as Russian disinformation follow this vague rubric. These included allegations that NATO is using Ukraine as a pawn in a proxy war against Russia and concerns that Ukrainian politicians are corrupt. Allegations that NATO is using Ukraine as a pawn in a proxy war. Do you not think that's a possibility? Is that not something that you would consider when they're involved in the 2014 coup, when there are CIA bases all over Ukraine, and that Russia is a long-standing enemy in a war for global supremacy? It seems perfectly reasonable. Ukrainian politicians are corrupt. That is also a matter of record. Right, now we're getting there. If you say actual facts that they don't like or they don't want you to hear, they'll shut you down. So it starts off all very nice, doesn't it? This misinformation could mislead people and lead them to make medical choices that are bad for them and their family. And that's it. That's the category of misinformation. Also, though, if you say stuff that's true, but it doesn't work for Pfizer or Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or the CIA, that's also misinformation. Also, though, we like NATO. I mean, what's left? This is what's left. Thank you. Yes, please. No, thank you. Okay, I'll go to work, have my taxes. But in the end, compliance. That's what's left for you, compliance. Ukraine's government has also worked with US government officials and others to censor its American critics. One prominent example is Aaron Mate, an independent journalist who has criticised US policy regarding Ukraine in other outlets. It's nice, it's just like reading all my mates. It's like if this was at school. Hey, I know him! Following the Russian invasion, Twitter, under its old ownership, flagged Mate to be censored after the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, and the Ukrainian Intelligence Agency included him on a list of accounts sent to the FBI that were suspected by the SBU in spreading fear and disinformation. Fear? I'm afraid you spread fear then. Wait a minute. This is actually an abstract concept. Sir, you just spread ennui and disappointment. A journalist writing a critique on US involvement in a foreign war has had his name sent to the FBI. Doesn't that concern you a little bit if you consider America's history and involvement in foreign wars, like, I don't know, Vietnam, Iraq, and all foreign wars ever, except perhaps the ones against actual Nazis? You would have questions, wouldn't you? That shouldn't be, sir, someone somewhere has got an opinion on American involvement in foreign war. Well, get that all the way to Hoover.
Mr. Vice President, someone finally bought a copy of your book, sir.
Like, that's something that should just be accepted in a democracy. And the fact that it isn't shows you where we are going. Just to have an opinion, just to write an article, just to oppose the powerful is becoming contraband. And while they're doing it, they're telling you that they're helping you. That's what makes it all the more terrifying for me. When we talk about dictatorship, sometimes maybe it sounds hyperbolic. Don't be ridiculous. You're free to do as you choose. There's a McDonald's over there. You could buy yourself some candy bars. But when a journalist writing about American involvement in foreign wars is flagged and his details are sent to the FBI, that is not freedom, that's not liberty, that's how you move towards dictatorship. What's happening, it seems to me, is that we are increasingly moving in the direction of centralized power and being told that to question that process is in itself hysterical, hyperbolic, conspiratorial, but it's evident it's happening. Like, if you think about it, Aaron Mate, I don't know if you know much about Aaron Mate, but he's like an intelligent journalist. Like, that don't seem right. You know, he's not like a lunatic. He's not like, oh, Russia. That's not the vibe he's on at all. You might, if you Googled Aaron Mate, what'll come up is conspiracy theorist or nut job or grey zone. But this is what's being created here. What we're seeing is the machinery that discredits dissent and legitimizes, and more than legitimizes, normalizes, almost invisibly, the shutting down of dissent and the crushing of critics through supporting independent media. Do you think for a minute that a CIA carve-out is like doing some philanthropic work? Because you know what worries me? It's Ukrainian independent media. Those underdogs can't get a break. Well, let's get over there and support those guys. Give them some dollars. Send Nina Yankovic. Nina! But it's about control. It's not about anything else, is it? Suddenly it gives you a different context for what happens to a figure like Alex Jones, who's controversial and rhetorically quite evangelical. Oh, well, it's Alex Jones. He's crazy. He said all those crazy things about Sandy Hook. He should be annihilated. Well, now we know the CIA were involved in that and were guiding that.
Does the Bureau practice entrapment a lot?
We get really close.
Not officially.
No. We get as close as we can.
Now we know that the CIA are not only interested in zealous, evangelical, fanciful figures that are full of flair. It's like now it's Glenn Greenwald is a problem, and Aaron Mate, and Jeremy Sachs, and Mearsheimer, like these sort of quite staid academics. Alex Jones is crazy. Oh yeah, he seems a bit crazy. Puffy cheeks and that stuff he said about frogs.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
Yeah, crazy. And plus Glenn Greenwald. Oh, what? Like was married to a man, doesn't he like adopt a lot of dogs, and didn't he win a Pulitzer Prize? Yeah, he's crazy. And Aaron Mate, what? Gabor Mate's son, who's the journalist. Yeah, he's crazy as well. So obviously, things like the Alex Jones takedown, or maybe Joe Rogan ivermectin CNN, or maybe old Russ, these things are like sort of vivid, glaring, colourful entertainment style characters that are a bit crazy. And then it's like credible journalists, academics, and you start thinking, well, what's the common thread here then? Is it that these are sort of dangerous figures that are a risk to their audience, or is it that there's just some information that you are not allowed? You are the problem in the end. What they've worked out is if you have the kind of information that Aaron Mate or Glenn Greenwald or Jeffrey Sachs are conveying and spreading and populating, or in the more entertainment skewed aspect of this, people like me are talking about, then you're going to go, well, I'm not paying those tax dollars anymore. I'm not participating in this. And increasingly, that's what you're getting. You're people that you're getting a situation where people serving in the American military are not pro foreign wars. I mean, once you get to that point, it's actually quite tentative. So this has to become increasingly insidious and immersive to prevent its own demise. Just months after the social media request, Ross Burley, a former Zinc Network and Open Information Partnership official now with the Centre for Information Resilience, spoke openly about his desire to censor critics of the war, including Mate. Burley argued that social media platforms needed more responsibility regarding what types of content to allow. Even I saw Russell Brand, who has a huge following on YouTube, was interviewing a journalist called Aaron Mate on his channel, said Burley, who added that it is incredibly irresponsible for YouTube and other social media companies to continue to host these people. Well, by some eerie coincidence, YouTube, as you saw in that Ukrainian video, don't know who funds that, demonetized me quite recently. What a coincidence. The organizations supported by the US government have also sought to silence critics inside Ukraine. Before the war, in one of President Zelensky's first controversial acts to stifle political opposition, he moved in February 2021 to close multiple television channels over allegations of Kremlin ties. Oh wow, so maybe those ties were not legitimate either. In May 2022, the Zelensky government widely expanded its efforts to outlaw the political opposition. Zelensky moved to ban 11 political parties over alleged ties to Russia. So ties to Russia is like a sort of weapon. ties to Russia, ties to Russia, ties to Russia. The function of it is to eliminate dissenting voices. I feel like I have to continually remind you, like, I know Ukrainian people. I don't want Ukrainian people to die. I just think that probably the Ukrainian government and the Russian government and the American government and the British government are all corrupt, and we'd be better off without them. Later that summer, other bills to crack down on media rights that had failed to pass in the past over civil liberty concerns were brought back into consideration. Among the on media law's most contentious provisions is the power granting a council controlled by Zelensky and his allies to ban media outlets without a court order. Now, they are a nation at war, and again, I would suggest you have a look at what Jeffrey Sachs says about how that war began and how they found themselves in that position and why there wasn't a peace treaty signed when one was available. And during times of war, censorship, I suppose, and centralized control is common, and perhaps it could be argued under some circumstances necessary. But if you remember, what we read and receive everywhere is that we are supporting this war. What is one of the words you hear? For freedom, for democracy. And whatever shutting down political opponents and media outlets is not democracy. It's not democracy when Ukraine do it. It's not democracy when CIA carve-outs do it. It's not democracy when they do it to brilliant journalists or academics or online YouTubers. It's not democracy. Free speech is a principle for a reason. And you can see now that the creation of the category of misinformation and the normalization of censorship is part of a play to generate further power and tools to control the potential opposition to that power. Ukraine's National Union of Journalists described the bill as the biggest threat to free speech in independent Ukraine's history. They're also Ukrainian. That's some other Ukrainian people. Support Ukraine. Which Ukraine? The Ukraine that believes in free speech, or the Ukraine that facilitates massive weapon sales? In the midst of the first months of the Russian invasion, many in Ukraine readily accepted the need for emergency government influence. The Ukrainian government condensed the major television channels into a single United News national broadcast that continues today. That's so sort of brazen, isn't it? Dun dun dun! United News. What does that mean? This is the only news you're getting. Many journalists voluntarily paused critical reporting of the Ukrainian government to focus on coverage of the Russian invasion. Now, over 2 years into the conflict, reporters are facing new difficulties in reporting on routine issues. Journalists taking a critical look at the government are facing intimidation and threats. Expressing viewpoints that run counter to Ukraine and NATO policies with respect to the war is enough to make an individual an enemy of the state. And of course, you'll be aware and perhaps in your mind repeating the name of Gonzalo Lira, the American journalist who died in Ukraine after saying he probably would die in Ukraine, whose name is seldom mentioned among other journalists imprisoned in foreign lands for writing the truth about the wars and conflicts they're reporting on. So it seems to me that what we have here, thanks to Li Fang's reporting, is another piece in the puzzle that demonstrates how media, the deep state, and powerful corporations work together to create an environment in which only their ideas are allowed to be communicated. It's only because it's so brazen when it's pieced together that you begin to feel irked and outraged by it, because generally this is normalized. The category of misinformation and disinformation and malinformation that you've heard here described as people speaking emotionally and passionately, telling the truth, is now a problem worthy of censorship. Academics, journalists, prize-winning journalists, online YouTubers, all shut down for the same reason. Not because what they're saying is untrue, but because what they're saying runs counter to the intentions of the powerful. So next time you see someone smeared, attacked, shut down, you have a series of questions in front of you to ask. What is the reason this person or this information is being cancelled, destroyed, or eliminated? Is it in order to protect me, or is it because they are a part in a chain, however small or insignificant, that could lead to dissent, objection, resistance, revolution, and therefore prevent what seems increasingly like a global scheme for total control from reaching its terrifying climax? But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and chat? Click the link in the description, join our movement, get additional content, and help us to oppose this incredible madness that's fully immersive, it seems, at this point. More important than that, if you can, stay free. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.